Welcome to the Capital Forum's Antitrust Thought Leaders interview series. I'm Teddy Downey, executive editor here at the Capital Forum, and I'm delighted to be here with Michael Kades, Deputy Assistant Attorney General for the Antitrust Division. Michael, thanks so much for doing this.
No, thank you for having me. I believe this account is a second-time caller, but many-time listener.
Yeah, and today we're talking about agriculture issues, and I just wanted to get your take overall. How do the recent enforcement actions fit into a broader agenda for enforcement and priorities when it comes to ag enforcement for the Antitrust Division?
So, yeah, I think think about that in sort of two categories. Like, one, why is ag a focus of this administration? Two, how does it really fit into the broader scope of what we're trying to do? Right, and so when you think about agriculture, the first thing is this is an area where whether it be seeds, whether it be meat production, livestock, at the retail food level, there's a lot. It's very concentrated. So that's a first indication that maybe it's a place you want to be concerned about for enforcement. The second, I think, thing to think about is agriculture in particular is non-diversified. So if you, right, like it is the driving force of rural America. So if you mess up in a rural area with agriculture, the follow-on effects aren't just the direct victims. You're really undermining the entire ecosystem of rural America. And we already know rural America is incredibly under stress, right? We are losing we've lost hundreds of thousands of family farms. Back in 2018, 2019, in my home state, Wisconsin, losing on average 2 dairy farms a day. So it's really, we need to be really careful that that lax antitrust enforcement isn't contributing to this problem. So it's something that really, I think, why we're concerned about it. And then, the third thing, bucket, is when you go out and you talk to the people, whether they be farmers, whether they be ranchers, they have been complaining, and I don't mean that in a negative way. They've been expressing concerns for decades. And I think what I think that you sort of hear is like, broadly, they'll say, look, back in the 80s, we sort of made this bet. If we just try to be as efficient as we can, America will export food and everybody will be better off. And on the one hand, our agricultural exports have grown tremendously. And despite that prosperity, it doesn't seem to be coming back to the people who grow the corn, raise the cattle. And so what? There's something wrong there. And so that's why we want to look at that. And then when you put that within larger of what, the vision sort of, I think Jonathan's articulated, thinking more broadly about the way competition operates. And, right, so if you take a look at our merger guidelines, right, like, one of the things we emphasize, how mergers affect suppliers and workers, how concerns about trends in concentration, concerns about mergers that actually sort of lead to consolidation or entrenched market power. Those are actually all sort of issues that are relevant to agriculture. So if you start, whether you look at what issues we're worried about or you start with ag, they kind of all fit together.
And I want to follow up quickly on the AgriStats case. And why is that case important to what you're doing?
So, right, the AgriStats case, it's an information sharing case. AgriStats is a company that's been around for a really long time, since the 80s. They collect a lot of information from almost all the meat processors, like covers 80% of chicken broilers, and when they were doing pork and turkey, same number. And then they would all this information would come to them, and then they would put it back out in reports, pages and pages of reports. Sometimes, almost within days of receiving it, they were turning it around. And what we've alleged is that that exchange of information, combined with how they presented it, and besides how they used it to advise companies, allowed the meat packers, big and small, like Tyson's, Cargill, were able to actually compete less vigorously with each other. And it wasn't because they necessarily knew what their competitors' price was exactly, but it gave them enough information that it made it easier not to compete. And so, that affects food prices for, all the Americans who, eat chicken, or at the time pork, or turkey. And so it's, that's sort of the end stage of the food supply. And it's, what traditionally, what's sort of interesting when it comes to information sharing, the agencies had these guidelines, they had these safe harbors. Said as long as you don't do A, B, and C, then you're probably okay. And they were set up in the 90s. So the world's a much different place. You can get a lot more information, and you can you don't need things that we 30 years ago would have said, oh well, you can't really tell what's going on, or you can't figure out who's doing what because it's de-anonymized or it's aggregated. That's not as true now. And so we have actually withdrawn those guidelines precisely because we want to focus on the impact, really focus on what is this information, how is it being shared, and how does it affect the way people compete when they're receiving it. And just today at the ABA, the chief antitrust counsel for InBev, some of us know them as Anheuser-Busch, said he thought that was really that was right. We had made the right decision. We need to go back to basic. That those criteria didn't make any sense. So, as much sense as they did in the past.
Yeah, and I actually want to stick on chicken for a second. You mentioned chicken. Can you tell me more about the consent decree in the chicken industry and how that's playing out, and how that differs from prior consent decrees?
Yeah. So I think the consent decree you're referring to, it was a case called United States versus Cargill, and it was also in some sense an information sharing case. What we alleged there was, again, for over decades. And look, as an antitrust lawyer, to think that these sorts of agreements occurred and lasted for a long time is kind of not what you learn in microeconomics. They should fall apart, but this one didn't. Others haven't. That, again, most of the chicken industry was engaged. It had an information sharing that was sort of run by a third company, where they were sharing lots of compensation information, and then that allowed them to actually not compete as aggressively for workers. We then lowered compensation, so workers were, we think, on over the time period, poultry workers, which is a rough job. It is not a safe job. It is a hard job. They were getting less, whether it be less pay, lower benefits, and so we brought this case, and Cargill and Wayne and Sanderson, three of the biggest processors, and then later George's, a fourth processor, have all signed a consent decree. And what's interesting about this consent decree, obviously, it has the stop sharing information portion. That's kind of like what you would traditionally expect. This one went farther in a number of ways. The first way is the companies agreed to pay restitution to the workers. The second thing that the monitor that we appointed, instead of just having sort of monitoring, are you complying with the specific provisions of the settlement, has a much broader mandate. And this is different, very unique, that they can look at how these companies are operating in the poultry processing industry writ large, and be like, wait a minute, so we have this oversight that just goes beyond the scope of the case. And the third thing is we sort of there's explicit protections that allow, that said that for workers and other people who interact with these companies, that they can't be retaliated against if they come to the government or the monitor. So those are sort of three things that make this sort of different than the standard remedy that we would often get in this kind of case.
I mean, that seems like has it had a big impact? Are you seeing positive impacts in the industry so far from that?
So I don't know that we've seen any direct, but it's courts move slow, or sometimes parties move slow. It's still not quite fully in force, but we expect it to, and because and so I mean, we fully expect it to. We're very excited about it.
And I know a lot of your work. There's been a lot of collaboration with other agencies, like the Department of Agriculture, like state AGs. What's been the impact of the executive order on competition and the Competition Council in terms of creating more dialogue on competition, bringing in the Department of Agriculture so that you all are on the same page? Specifically, I'm thinking of packers and stockyards. How are you working with the Department of Agriculture to get those rules out, get those rules enforced, get change change the dynamic there, because that seems to be the key tool to make sure that these, farmers are not under the thumb of the big players in the supply chain.
Yeah, no, I entirely agree with you that Packers and Stockyards Act is really an important tool. And just maybe a little bit by way of introduction, right? The Congress passed the Packers and Stockyards Act in 1921. Not the most liberal or progressive Congress in the history of the United States, and even that Congress, when they looked at the way meat packing worked. And this was despite the fact that the FTC had done a major study on meat packing, the U.S. Department of Justice had issued a huge consent decree. Congress is still not enough. And I think what that Congress understood was that this isn't just about competition. This is also about things like fairness and avoiding discrimination. And so for a variety of reasons, that in statute sort of fell out, sort of was overlooked or not used, or there's sort of case law sort of limiting it. But one of the things that also I think to understand the challenge is it's a USDA statute that often requires DOJ enforcement. And I think one of the things what the Biden administration's executive order unlocked was that it's really important that those two agencies work together. Because otherwise, you can have sort of one going off one way, one going off the other way. And so just as an example, also part of that Cargill case we were talking about was for poultry farmers, growers, right? The economic model is you don't own your chickens, you don't own your seed. The processor gives you all of that. 6 weeks later, they pick up your chickens and they weigh them and you get sort of a base pay. But then they compare you to everybody else in the area. And you can get a penalty or you can get a bonus. And the difference between those two it's not small. As much as, it might be like the difference between, a 20-30% difference between minimum and maximum. And these farmers who are depending on the processor for the chickens, they are undertaking millions of dollars of debt to be part of this. And then they're sort of in this system where it's almost, where it's like, imagine like if any of our jobs every 6 weeks, you found out maybe you were earning $100, maybe you were earning 80, or maybe you were earning 120, and you just didn't really know. And so not really doesn't sound in competition, but it sounds in basic deception and unfairness. And so we sort of brought this allegation against Wayne and Sanderson that the way they were conducting this was unfair and was deceptive, because the farmer really couldn't know, the grower, what was really going to happen. That kind of story is really good for enforcement. How to solve it is a little harder, but at the same time, USDA was writing regulations about what kind of disclosures were required. And so what you ended up with was we bring a case laying out the liability, and when it comes time to remedy, we can, USDA sort of says, hey, this is how to get rid of the deception. And so our order just was able to rely on the work of USDA. And so rather than us being sort of, ag pun here, siloed, instead we were working together, and that's sort of the most obvious. But obviously we're working with them as they do their regulations and thinking about the best way to leverage our resources. We smaller things, we have a joint portal for complaint. But in a lot of ways, if you were to ask me what is the best example of the whole of government approach, it is, I think, what the work we're doing on Packers and Stockyards and leveraging our relative strengths with the USDA's to try to reinvigorate this, which I think fundamentally important statute.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for doing this. Always a pleasure.
Yeah.
It's so great to see you.
No, always great to see you, Teddy. Thank you so much.